The claw marks were the first thing she saw. Deep and black against the pale, weathered wood of her door, they were gouged into the grain with impossible force, 4 of them, running diagonally from the top hinge to the rusted latch. They were not the work of any forest cat or bear. The splinters around the edges were scorched, as if the claws that made them had been burning with a dark, internal fire. Alara stood on the damp cobblestones of her tiny path, a basket of herbs forgotten in her hand. The scent of crushed lavender and chamomile filled the cold morning air, a fragile sweetness against the metallic tang of fear that now coated the village. No one was speaking to her. They watched, of course, from behind twitching curtains, from the shadowed doorways of the bakery and the smithy. Their eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and awe. They looked at her like she was already a ghost, because they all knew who had made those marks. The Alpha King's beast. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, not in the way their own wolves were. The stories said it was the king's power made manifest, a shadow of pure dominance that answered only to his rage. It was said that where the beast walked, the ground froze, that it was a promise of death, a mark of ownership. And it had marked her door. A tremor started in her hands, rattling the basket. Why? Why her? Alara was nothing. Less than nothing. She was the village scribe, a creature of ink and parchment, tolerated for her neat hand but otherwise invisible. She was small, quiet, and worthless. Her own mother had told her so every day of her life. The whispers had started before dawn, a dark shape moving through the mists, a cold that settled in the bones, the sound of a predator's growl that was not a sound at all, but a pressure in the soul. And then the shriek of wood being torn asunder. Now, her little cottage, the only place she had ever felt a sliver of safety, was a monument to her ruin. The mark was a declaration. Mine. No wolf in the pack, no soul in the village, dared cross it. But it was not a shield. It was a cage. It had separated her from her world as surely as a headsman's axe. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back, but she couldn't tear her gaze from the deep, violent grooves in her door. A horrifying, impossible thought flickered through her. It felt like a promise. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. What had she done to be claimed by a monster? Her mind reeled back, grasping for a cause, for an answer, and landed 3 weeks earlier on the day the cold had first come into her life. 3 weeks earlier, Alara had been just as worthless, but at least she had been ignored. Her life was a small, quiet rhythm of grinding ink, trimming quills, and transcribing the village ledgers. She lived in the shadow of her mother, Lyra, a woman whose beauty had faded into a sharp-edged bitterness. "Head down, Alara." Lyra's voice was a constant, chipping whisper in her life. "Don't draw attention. We are here on sufferance. Remember that." Alara remembered. She spent her days in a small, dusty room at the back of the elders' hall, her world smelling of old paper and beeswax. She was a good scribe. Her letters were perfect, her lines straight. But her knowledge was a secret shame. She didn't just copy words, she consumed them. She had read every book that had ever passed through her hands, histories of the great packs, tales of the old magic, genealogies of the Alpha Kings. She knew more about the kingdom than the elder himself, but that knowledge was a dangerous currency she would never dare to spend. It was just another thing to hide. Her mother hated her books. Filling your head with nonsense. No man wants a woman with an ink-stained mind. He wants a strong back and a silent mouth. Alara had neither. She was frail, and her mind was a loud, chaotic library of stories she could never tell. That day had been worse than usual. Kyle, the son of a prominent pack hunter, had cornered her on her way home. He was broad and cruel, with a smile that never reached his eyes. He enjoyed her fear. Little mouse, he'd sneered, blocking her path, always scurrying away. What are you hiding in that cottage of yours? Books? He'd snatched the small loaf of bread from her basket. A real wolf needs meat, not this. He took a bite, chewing with his mouth open, and tossed the rest into the mud. She had just stood there, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, until he grew bored and sauntered away. Humiliation burned hot in her throat. She hadn't gone home. Instead, she'd fled to the woods, the one place her mother's voice and Kale's sneer couldn't reach her. The storm broke without warning, a sudden violent downpour that turned the forest floor into a sucking mire. Drenched and shivering, she'd finally stumbled back toward the village edge as dusk bled into night. And that's when she saw him. He was a heap of dark cloaks and shadows collapsed near the low stone wall that marked her small property. At first, she thought he was a drunk from the tavern, but there was a stillness to him, a density that was wrong. A strange cold radiated from him, pushing back the damp evening air. Her mother's voice screamed in her head, "Don't draw attention, walk away." She took a step, then another. But she couldn't. There was something in his stillness that wasn't just unconsciousness. It was a profound and terrible exhaustion, a weight that seemed to press him into the very earth. Hesitantly, she crept closer. A man. Large, built with the hard lines of a warrior. His face was turned away, hidden by a fall of dark, damp hair. One hand was clenched in the mud, the knuckles white. Even in collapse, he looked dangerous. She should have run. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime of keeping her head down, screamed at her to flee. But then a low groan escaped him, a sound of such deep, guttural pain that it bypassed her fear and went straight to the small, foolishly soft part of her heart she tried so hard to protect. She knelt beside him. "Sir?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Are you hurt?" He didn't respond. She reached out a trembling hand, hesitating an inch from his shoulder. The cold coming off him was shocking, like the air over a frozen lake in deep winter. It wasn't natural. Taking a deep breath, she touched him. The cold seized her. It shot up her arm, a painful, invasive frost that made her gasp and snatch her hand back. Her fingers were numb, tinged blue. It was like touching a block of solid ice. But beneath the cold, she'd felt it. A tremor. A flicker of life, fighting against a crushing, unnatural winter. She couldn't leave him here. The night was growing colder. The rain would steal what little warmth he had left. He would die. The decision was madness. It went against every rule she had ever lived by. But the thought of walking away, of leaving him to freeze in the mud, was suddenly unbearable. For once in her life, she would not scurry away. It took all of her strength to move him. He was immensely heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her arms under his, straining, her feet slipping in the mud. He was a giant, and she was a reed. But she pulled. She dragged him, inch by painful inch, across her small yard and through the door of her cottage. The effort left her gasping, her muscles screaming in protest. She managed to get him onto the rag rug in front of her small, cold hearth. There, in the dim light of her single candle, she finally saw his face. It was a face that belonged on a mountain, carved from granite and glaciers. Harsh, beautiful, and utterly merciless. High cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with dark stubble, a mouth that looked like it had never known how to smile. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow. Even unconscious, his expression was one of severe, absolute authority. He was terrifying, and he was burning with a cold fever. His skin was pale, his lips blue, yet a fine sheen of sweat covered his brow. She pressed her hand to his forehead and flinched again at the deep, unnatural chill. She worked frantically, stripping off his wet, heavy cloak. It was simple, dark wool, but of a quality she had never touched before. Beneath it, he wore black leather tunics, worn but clearly made for a king. There were no crests, no signs of allegiance. He was a mystery. A very large, very cold mystery now lying on her floor. She piled her 2 thin blankets over him and built up the fire, using precious wood she had been saving. The flames seemed to shy away from him, the warmth barely touching the aura of frost that surrounded his body. Her mother would kill her, if she found him here. Lyra's fear of drawing notice was a palpable thing. A strange man, a warrior, in their house. It was a disaster. He stirred, a low groan rumbling in his chest. His eyes flickered open. They were the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, a pale, flat gray, so light they were almost silver. And they were filled with a pain so vast and ancient it made her breath catch. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, confused. Where? His voice was a rasp, deep and rough. "You're safe," she said, her voice small. "You collapsed. I brought you inside." He tried to push himself up, his arms shaking with the effort. The air in the small cottage grew colder, a visible mist pluming from his lips. "I cannot. Stay." "You're in no state to move," she said, surprised at her own firmness. "You have a fever." A harsh, humorless sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. "Not a fever." He fell back, his head hitting the floor with a dull thud. His eyes closed. The cold seemed to intensify, and she shivered, hugging her arms. What had she done? She had brought a winter storm into her home. For 2 days he drifted in and out of consciousness. Elara did what she could. She forced warm broth between his lips. She kept the fire roaring, even though it seemed to do little good. She sat with him, a book open in her lap, reading the words aloud just to fill the oppressive, cold silence. She read from an old history of the Northern Kings, a lineage known for its brutality and its strange affinity for the ice. She didn't sleep. She was too afraid. Afraid he would die. Afraid he would wake up. Afraid her mother would come for her weekly visit and find him. On the 3rd morning, she woke from a slumped doze in her chair to find him watching her. His gray eyes were clear, lucid, and sharp as shards of ice. The terrible pain was gone, replaced by a guarded, unreadable intensity. He was sitting up, the blankets pooled around his waist. The cold in the room had lessened, though it still clung to him like a shroud. "You read to me," he stated. It wasn't a question. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. She nodded, unable to speak. "The line of Theron the Unbroken," he continued, his voice a low rumble. "You have an interest in history?" I am a scribe," she stammered. "I copy books." He considered her for a long moment, his gaze so penetrating she felt he could see every secret she had ever kept. "A scribe in a village like this?" "My father. He was one, before me." She looked down at her ink-stained fingers. He pushed the blankets aside and rose to his feet. He was even taller than she had realized, a giant who filled her tiny cottage, his head nearly brushing the low rafters. He moved with a stiff, pained grace, but the weakness was gone. All that remained was a formidable, restrained power. He walked to the fire, turning his hands over the flames. He seemed to be drawing the heat into himself, a hungry, desperate act. "I will be gone when I am able," he said, his back to her. It was a clear boundary, a dismissal. "You're still not well," she said quietly. "The cold. It's still in you." He went rigid. Slowly, he turned his head, his silver eyes locking onto hers. "What do you know of the cold?" The question was soft, but it held the threat of an avalanche. "I feel it," she whispered. "When I touch you. It's wrong. It's not alive." Something flickered in his eyes. Shock, maybe. He looked at her differently then. The guard was still there, but it was joined by a flicker of grudging respect. Or perhaps just curiosity. "Stay away from me," he commanded, his voice harsh. "It is not safe." He was setting a rule, a wall between them. This is for shelter only, nothing more. She should have been relieved. Instead, a strange pang of disappointment hit her. She obeyed. She kept her distance. She left food for him on the small table and retreated to her corner with her books. But the cottage was too small for them to truly be separate. His presence filled every inch of it. The scent of him, pine and winter and cold stone, was a constant thing. She found herself watching him. He spent hours staring into the fire, his expression locked in a grim internal battle. She saw the moments when the pain hit him, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a clenching of his fists. The temperature in the room would drop, and he would fight it, his whole body tense with the effort of containment. He was holding something terrible at bay, something that was trying to consume him from the inside out. He was a fortress, cold and impenetrable. But she saw the cracks. One evening, he was cleaning his knives by the firelight when the sound of shouting erupted from the village square. Kale's voice, loud and bullying. Alara flinched, instinctively drawing into herself. The stranger's head lifted, his eyes narrowing. "Who is that?" "No one," she said quickly. "Just a villager." He looked from the window back to her, and his gaze was sharp. He saw the fear she was trying to hide. He didn't press, but he didn't look away either. Later that night, she woke to a sound at her door. A scraping, then a hard knock. "Little Mouse!" Kale's slurred voice came through the wood. "I know you're in there. I saw the smoke from your chimney. Keeping yourself warm? Maybe you need some company." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She was frozen in her bed. "Open the door, Alara. Don't make me break it down." Before she could even think, the stranger was on his feet. He moved with a silence that was terrifying in a man his size. He put a finger to his lips, his gray eyes blazing with a cold fire she hadn't seen before. He wasn't in pain now. He was something else entirely. He was a predator. He gestured for her to stay put. He walked to the door, not making a sound. The latch rattled as Kale tried to force it. The stranger didn't open the door. He simply placed his palm flat against the wood. A loud crack echoed from outside, followed by a sharp yelp of pain and surprise. A thick layer of frost instantly spread from his hand, covering the entire door in a delicate, deadly filigree of ice. The air in the cottage plummeted, and she could see her breath. "Go away," the stranger said, his voice low and vibrating with a power that shook the very walls. It was not a request. It was a fundamental command, altering the fabric of the night. There was a frantic scrambling sound, then silence. Slowly, the stranger removed his hand from the door. The frost remained. He turned to look at her, his face a mask of cold fury. But the fury wasn't for her. She saw something else in his eyes, something that looked almost protective. "He will not bother you again," he said. The boundary between them, the one he had erected so carefully, had just been eroded. He had protected her. The next morning he was gone. The fire was out. The blankets were neatly folded. The only sign he had ever been there was the faint, lingering scent of winter and the impossible frost that still coated the inside of her door, slowly melting into dark tear tracks on the wood. A hollow ache opened in her chest, a sense of loss so sharp and unexpected it stole her breath. She had known him for less than a week. She didn't even know his name. But her small, quiet world felt empty without his large, cold, dangerous presence in it. Life returned to its dull rhythm, but something had changed. Kale avoided her, his eyes wide with fear whenever he saw her. The other villagers gave her a wider berth, whispering about the frost on her door that took 2 days to fully melt. She had drawn attention. Her mother's greatest fear had come to pass. Lyra arrived a week later, her face a thundercloud. "What have you done?" she hissed, storming into the cottage without a greeting. "The whole village is talking, about you, about this house, about a man." "I did nothing," Ilara said, her voice small. "You did everything." Lyra's eyes swept the tiny room, searching. "You exist. That is your crime. I told you to be invisible. I told you to be nothing. But you have to have your books, your secrets. You're just like him." "Like who?" Ilara whispered, a cold dread creeping up her spine. "Like my father?" Lyra's face contorted with a vicious ancient grief. "Your father was a fool who believed in fairy tales. He thought there was power in our bloodline, a magic that would make us great. It didn't make him great. It got him killed. And it left a stain on you." "A stain?" "Something wrong," her mother spat. "Something unnatural. I've spent your whole life trying to scrub it out of you, to keep you safe by keeping you small. And now you've invited a monster into our lives." Before Ilara could ask what she meant, the village bell began to toll. Not the slow peal for a meeting, but the frantic, urgent clang of an alarm. An arrival. Lyra went pale. "He's here." "Who?" "The Alpha King." Panic seized the village. People scurried into their homes, barring their doors. The Alpha King, Theron, had not visited these outlying territories in a generation. He was a figure of terrifying legend, a ruler of immense power, said to be as cold and unforgiving as the northern wastes from which his ancestors had come. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She remembered the book she had read to the stranger. The line of Theron the Unbroken. No, it couldn't be. She watched from her small window as a procession of enormous wolves, their pelts the color of storm clouds, trotted into the square. They moved with a disciplined, lethal grace, and at their head walked a man. He was not cloaked this time. He wore black armor that seemed to drink the light, a high collar framing his head. His dark hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp granite lines of his face and the silvery scar through his eyebrow. He moved with an unhurried, absolute authority, his silver-gray eyes sweeping over the terrified village as if it were nothing more than dust beneath his boots. It was him, the stranger from her cottage, the man she had saved. He was the king. Theron's gaze passed over the houses, the shops, the elders' hall, dismissing them all. Then his eyes found her cottage, and they stopped. He started walking. Not toward the elder who was trembling in the center of the square, but directly toward her. Each step was heavy, deliberate, a pronouncement. The world seemed to hold its breath. Her mother made a choked, terrified sound behind her. "What did you do?" Ilara couldn't answer. She couldn't breathe. He stopped in front of her door. He didn't look at her, though he must have known she was watching from the window. He simply stared at the wood, at the spot where the frost had been. For a long moment he was utterly still. Then, a flicker. A distortion in the air beside him. A shadow detached itself from his body, coalescing into a shape of deeper darkness. It was a wolf, but not a wolf. It was huge, spectral, made of living night and cold rage. Its eyes were burning embers. The beast. Theron lifted a hand, and the beast mirrored the motion, raising a shadowy paw. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air crackled with his power, with his silent, unshakable will. And then it happened. The beast's claws, made of solidified shadow and ice, raked down the front of her door. The sound was a scream of tearing wood and sizzling frost. It carved 4 deep, black gouges into the pale surface. The king lowered his hand. The beast dissolved back into his shadow. He had marked her. In front of the entire pack, in front of her mother, he had laid a claim that was as absolute as death. He turned, his cold eyes finally meeting hers through the window. There was no warmth in them, No recognition of the person who had shared her fire and her broth. There was only the grim, possessive finality of a king. And that brought her back to the present, standing in the cold morning light, staring at the violation on her door. The door opened. Not her door. The king's. Two of his royal guards, wolves in human form with eyes the color of old gold, stood on her path. They did not look at her with contempt or pity. They looked at her with a kind of fearful reverence. "The king requires your presence," one of them said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a request. She was escorted from her home, leaving the forgotten basket of herbs on the path. The villagers melted away as she passed, refusing to meet her eyes. She was no longer one of them. She was his. She walked through the village she had lived in her entire life and felt like a complete stranger. The journey to the royal fortress was a blur. She sat numbly in a carriage, the world passing by in a smear of green and brown. The fortress was a spike of black rock that clawed at the sky, a place of sharp angles and cold stone. It was a perfect reflection of its master. She was led not to a dungeon, but to a suite of rooms high in the main tower. They were luxurious, with a soft bed, a fire already burning in the hearth, and a balcony that overlooked the vast dark forest of the kingdom. It was the most beautiful cage she had ever seen. He came to her that evening. The armor was gone, replaced by simple black tunics, but the aura of power and cold was even more pronounced. He stood in the center of the room, a looming mountain of a man, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. "You are here for your safety," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The wall between them was back, higher and colder than ever. Nothing more. She found her voice, though it was a thin, trembling thing. "Why?" "The man who accosted you at your door has been dealt with," he said, ignoring her question. "But he was a symptom, not the disease. There are those in my kingdom who see kindness as weakness. They would have seen you as a vulnerability to be exploited. A way to get to me." "A way to get to you?" she whispered. "I am nothing to you." His jaw tightened. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes. The memory of a warm hearth, of a soft voice reading in the dark. Then it was gone, buried under a glacier of control. "You showed me mercy when I was weak," he stated, as if reciting a fact from a ledger. "That created a debt. The mark on your door is the payment of that debt. It declares you under my protection. No one will harm you now." "You have imprisoned me," she said, a spark of her old, hidden defiance flickering to life. "I have saved you," he countered, his voice like grinding stone. "There is a difference." He took a step closer, and the cold rolling off him was a physical force. She could feel it in her teeth, in her bones. "There is a curse on my bloodline, scribe, a wasting sickness of the soul that is exacerbated by connection. It turns warmth to ice. It feeds on emotion. I am what I am because I have felt nothing for 500 years." He was finally explaining the cold, the unnatural chill she had felt, the pain he was constantly fighting. It was a curse, a power that was consuming him. "My proximity is a danger to you," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense rasp. "And your proximity is a danger to me. The boundary between us is not a request. It is a necessity for survival. Mine, and perhaps yours. Do you understand?" She understood all too well. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. He was dying a slow, cold death, and he believed that any flicker of feeling would be the final blow. Her act of kindness hadn't just created a debt, it had lit a match in a frozen, gas-filled room. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered. The words felt like ash in her mouth. The days that followed were a torment of gilded loneliness. She had everything she could want: food, warmth, silks instead of rough spun wool. She even had books. A whole library was placed at her disposal, filled with texts she had only ever dreamed of reading. But she was a prisoner. The guards were polite, but implacable. The servants bowed and scraped, but would not meet her eye. She was the king's property, a strange, untouchable treasure. He did not visit her again. She saw him sometimes from her balcony, a distant dark figure crossing a courtyard, always alone. The fortress was full of people, of wolves, but he moved through them in a bubble of absolute solitude. She ached for him, a foolish, hopeless ache for the man who had looked at her with pained, grateful eyes, not the cold king who had entombed her in his fortress. Her life became a quiet routine, reading, staring out at the forest, trying not to think, trying not to feel. The crisis came a month into her captivity. It began with a cough. A small orphaned pup named Finn, a boy of about 6 who helped in the kitchens, had taken a shy liking to her. He would sometimes leave a warm roll or a piece of fruit outside her door. He was the only soul in the castle who treated her like a person. One day, he didn't come. She learned from a nervous servant that Finn was sick. A fever, they said. But soon, whispers spread through the castle. It wasn't a normal fever. The boy was cold. Ice cold. The healers were baffled. His body grew colder and colder, no matter how many blankets they piled on, no matter how high they stoked the fire in his small room in the healer's ward. Ilara knew that cold. She had to see him. She begged her guards, but they refused. The king's orders were absolute. She was not to leave her rooms. Desperate, she waited until the dead of night, and using knowledge gleaned from a history book about the fortress's construction, she found a loose stone in the back of her fireplace that led to a narrow servant's passage. Her heart pounded as she crept through the dark, cold tunnels of the castle. She found the healer's ward. It was quiet, save for the low, pained whimpers coming from one room. She slipped inside. The sight broke her heart. Little Finn was lying on a cot, his skin pale and blue-tinged, his breath coming in misty puffs. The air in the room was freezing. It was the same unnatural cold, the same soul-deep chill that had radiated from Thuron. A healer sat slumped in a chair, exhausted and defeated. "We've tried everything," the old woman whispered, not even surprised to see Ilara. "It's like the life is just freezing out of him." Ilara knelt by the cot and touched Finn's hand. The cold shot up her arm, familiar and horrifying. But this time, she felt something else. Beneath the ice, she felt the tiny, flickering ember of his life being smothered. And within herself, she felt a strange answering warmth. A deep, resonant heat that wanted desperately to push back against the frost. Suddenly, the door to the ward slammed open. Theron stood there, his face a mask of thunder. His eyes, blazing with fury, fell on her. "What are you doing here? I gave you an order." But then his gaze shifted to the boy on the cot, and the fury in his face crumbled, replaced by a raw, naked agony. He looked at Finn, and it was clear he wasn't just seeing a dying child. He was seeing a ghost, a memory. "Not again," he breathed, the words a wisp of vapor in the cold air. "I cannot lose another." He stumbled forward, his control shattered. He looked from the boy to her, his eyes filled with a desperate, terrible plea he would never voice. He was the king, all-powerful, and he was helpless. In that moment, he was not the king. He was the stranger on her floor, broken and consumed by a pain he could not fight. All the fear and resentment she had felt toward him vanished, replaced by an overwhelming wave of empathy. She reached out and took Finn's small, icy hand in one of hers. With her other hand, she reached for Thuron. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. She laid her hand on his arm. His cold was immense, a vast Arctic emptiness. but her warmth was there too, a small, steady flame in the heart of a blizzard. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at her, his silver eyes swimming with unshed tears. The fortress, the crown, the centuries of solitude, it all fell away. There was only a man, terrified of being alone again. "I am saying that I love you, Alara, and it's going to kill me." The words, torn from the deepest part of him, hit her with the force of a physical blow. He loved her. He believed that love would be his end, that it would feed the curse and finally consume him. And he had said it anyway. Before she could process it, a new voice, sharp and venomous, cut through the charged air. "So, the stain has finally revealed itself." Ilara froze. She knew that voice. She turned, her heart sinking into a cold pit of dread. Her mother, Lyra, stood in the doorway, flanked by two guards Ilara didn't recognize. Her face was alight with a triumphant, malevolent glee. "I knew there was something foul in you," Lyra said, her eyes fixed on Ilara's hand, still touching the dying boy. "A monster, just like your father. His gift was a curse that drew unnatural things to him. And now yours has drawn the greatest monster of all." Theron moved, placing himself between Ilara and her mother. "You are not welcome here," he growled, his voice a low threat. "Oh, I think I am," Lyra sneered, unafraid. "Lord Valerius invited me." She gestured to one of the guards beside her, a man with a cruel smile, a treacherous advisor. The early villain, Kyle, was just a pawn. This was the real threat. "He agrees that the king's new pet is a danger to the pack, a weak point, a scribe with a tainted bloodline." She stepped forward, her gaze locking with Ilara's. "I tried to protect you. I tried to keep you small, to keep you worthless, so no one would ever see the rot inside you. I put a seal on you when you were just a baby, a seal of fear and shame, to smother whatever power your father believed in. But you wouldn't stay broken, would you? You had to reach for something more." The truth hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow. The worthlessness she had carried her entire life. It wasn't innate. It had been built. It was a cage her own mother had constructed around her heart, brick by brick, whisper by whisper. The rage that rose in her was a hot, searing torrent. All the years of humiliation, of feeling small and invisible, of being told she was nothing, it all coalesced into a desire to scream, to hurt, to break the woman who had broken her. She looked at her mother's twisted face, alight with bitter triumph. She looked at Theron, standing ready to kill for her, his own life hanging by a thread. She looked at little Finn, his life fading under the touch of a curse she now understood was a mirror of the king's. The rage was a fire in her blood. It demanded vengeance. It demanded that Lyra feel a fraction of the pain she had inflicted. But then, looking at her mother, Ilara saw past the hate. She saw a woman terrified, a woman so consumed by the grief of losing her mate, so haunted by a power she didn't understand, that she had chosen to mutilate her own daughter's spirit rather than risk losing her too. Her cruelty wasn't born of strength. It was born of a pathetic, all-consuming fear. The rage inside Ilara didn't vanish. It simply yielded. It gave way to something else, something she had never felt for her mother before. Pity. The choice was there. To hold on to the rage and let it define her. Or to let it go. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She looked her mother in the eye. "You were just afraid," Ilara said, her voice quiet but clear, echoing in the silent room. And with those words of forgiveness, something inside her broke. Not broke. Unlocked. The seal of fear and shame shattered. The warmth she had always felt as a tiny, flickering ember erupted into a brilliant golden sun. It poured out of her, a wave of pure life and heat, It was not a violent power. It was a gentle, overwhelming dawn. The light filled the room, warm and smelling of summer fields. It washed over little Finn, and the blue tint of his skin vanished, replaced by a healthy pink. The unnatural cold around him evaporated like mist in the morning sun. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and his eyes fluttered open, clear and bright. The golden light swirled around Theron. He gasped, stumbling back, not in pain, but in sheer, unadulterated shock. The deep, soul-level cold that had been his constant companion for 5 centuries, the curse that was slowly killing him, it recoiled. It shrank back from her warmth. For the first time since he was a young man, the ice in his veins receded. He felt warmth. Her mother and the treacherous guards stared, their faces masks of disbelief and terror. The power Ilara wielded was not dark or unnatural. It was pure, radiant life. Theron's royal guards, loyal to him, moved with swift, brutal efficiency. Valerius and his cohorts were seized. Lyra simply stood there, broken and defeated, the foundation of her entire life's bitterness washed away by the light. But Ilara only had eyes for Theron. He stared at her, his silver eyes wide. He reached out a hand, not as a king, not as a warrior, but as a man seeing the sunrise for the first time. He touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the path of a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. His hand was warm. A choked sound escaped him. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. It wasn't a desperate, pained embrace. It was a grounding, a homecoming. He held her not like a precious, fragile thing, but like an anchor, the one solid point in his entire storm-tossed existence. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In the circle of his arms, she felt his awe, his gratitude, his overwhelming, boundless love. It was a love that was no longer a death sentence. It was a cure. She was not worthless. She was not a stain. She was a healer. She was his salvation. And he was hers. 6 months later, the world was a different place. The black stone of the fortress no longer seemed so menacing. Flowers grew in the courtyards, planted by the new queen. Laughter was heard in the halls. Ilara was no longer a prisoner. She was a partner. Her official title was queen, but the people called her the Sun Queen. Her healing gift, once a source of shame, was now the kingdom's greatest strength. She worked alongside the healers, her warmth and light mending what was broken. Her mother had been sent to a quiet convent in the west, a place of reflection and solitude. It was a mercy Ilara had requested. Forgiveness had unlocked her power. It was only right that it be followed by grace. Theron was transformed. The grim, cold king was gone. The lines of pain on his face had softened. He smiled now, a slow, rare thing that was more beautiful than any sunrise. The curse was not gone. It was a part of him, a deep well of power he was learning to control, but it no longer consumed him. Her warmth held it at bay, a constant, living balance to his winter. She found him in the library, their library, a book open in his lap. He wasn't reading. He was just watching her, a look of quiet wonder on his face that still, after all these months, made her heart skip a beat. "What is it?" she asked, coming to sit beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. He took her hand, his fingers, once so cold, now a familiar warmth against hers. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "For centuries, my beast was a weapon, a thing of rage and possession. I used it to inspire fear." He looked toward the door of their chambers. After the crisis, she had asked that her old door from the cottage be brought to the fortress. It was now the door to their private rooms, a reminder of where they had begun. The 4 deep black claw marks were still there, stark against the weathered wood. "When it marked your door," he continued, "I thought I was caging you, claiming you. but I was wrong. He turned his silver-gray eyes to her, and they were filled with a love so profound it was a physical presence in the room. It wasn't marking you for me, it was marking me for you. It knew. Before I did, it knew that you were the only one who could ever lead me home. The claw marks were not a brand of ownership. They were a sign of surrender. The monster had been kneeling at her door, begging for the salvation only she could provide. She leaned into him, feeling the steady, warm beat of his heart. She was home. They both were.